This was supposed to be an easy summer job. Working in a movie theater is usually a breeze. Sure, it can get stressful if you're ringing up a long line of impatient jerks running late for the latest superhero flick. But the Silver Cinema isn't some 20-screen big city multiplex. It's a 3-screen revival house in a small town. I might get 9 or 10 people coming through the door on a busy night. Most of the time, there isn't even any spilled popcorn to sweep up at the end of my shift. It should have been the easiest $8.50 an hour I ever made. Instead, it's become a waking nightmare. The worst part at first was dealing with Clyde, the manager. He's got a mean streak and a drinking problem. I don't know if the old man never cared about classic movies, or if running this dump for 15 years just burned all that out of him. I'm not exactly a big movie buff myself, so I don't much care one way or the other. I just figure you'd have to be passionate or crazy to open a money pit like this in the first place. He's not afraid to cut corners to keep the lights on. We screen mostly silent films. Whatever public domain junk Clyde can get his hands on. One of the perks of managing a silent picture show is that you don't have to worry about audio bleeding from one theater into the next, so you save on insulation. The walls of the Silver Cinema are thin, so thin that even though I was standing behind the concession counter last Friday night, I could hear the terrified screams coming from Theater 3 loud and clear. It had been a typically slow night. An older couple had shown up for the Douglas Fairbanks movie in Theater 1. Theater 2 was completely empty, and one woman had bought a ticket for the marathon of Buster Keaton shorts in Theater 3. She had been on the young side, younger than most of our patrons anyway, and had struck me as pretty. It had been raining, and the rain had given her black hair a reflective sheen, like a dead computer monitor. My first thought when I heard the screaming was that she was being attacked. But I know for certain she was alone in there. I remember being surprised that a girl like her had nothing better to do on a Friday evening. I sprinted across the lobby and shoved the door to Theater 3, which barely budged. It felt like it might have gotten snagged on a lump of torn carpet. The carpeting in that flea pit is ratty and threadbare and bunched up in places. It took me 4 or 5 tries to shoulder the thing open. By the time I finally did, the screaming had already stopped. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow blundered into Theater 2 by mistake, but that was impossible. There was a movie playing up on the screen, and I don't turn on the projector if there aren't any ticket sales. I made that mistake once, and Clyde threatened to dock my pay. So I knew I hadn't picked the wrong door. I was standing in the center aisle of Theater 3, with rows of vacant seats to my left and right. The theater was empty. The woman was gone. I moved cautiously down the aisle, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. The whole room was bathed in grayish light that flickered fitfully as if cast by a sputtering candle. It threw strange shadows all over the place, shadows that didn't stay put from one second to the next. The Silver Cinema has no emergency exits, a fact that I often fantasize about bringing to OSHA's attention whenever Clyde flies off the handle at me over some minor screw-up. So either the woman had vanished into thin air, or she was still somewhere in the room. The silence was immaculate. There can't be many places on Earth quieter than a rundown silent movie theater 1 hour before closing time. But this was the quietest it had ever been. I steadied myself against the chair backs as I went along. When I happened to look up at the screen, the towering figure looking back at me was not Buster Keaton. It was a tall, gaunt man with a scarred face and wild, staring eyes. The shot only framed him from the waist up, but as far as I could tell, he seemed to be wearing a butcher's apron. He was standing perfectly still, so still that, at first glance, I assumed the projector had stalled out. And then, as if to refute that theory, he started nodding his gray, flickering head. A smile spread slowly over his disfigured face. I must have mixed up the screenings somehow, or maybe Clyde had gotten a head start on his customary weekend bender and grabbed the wrong film canisters out of the basement. He always loaded all the projectors before he left for the day. All I had to do was charge admission and change the reels. I tried to remember what the woman had said when she had paid for her ticket. She had mumbled the title under her breath, and when I had asked her to repeat herself, she had just gestured meekly at Theater 3, brushing her wet hair out of her eyes. Clyde's habit is to stash the empty canisters under the counter where I work, so that I have them handy when the time comes to close up. I decided to go take a look at them. It made more sense than standing in that darkened theater, waiting for something to break the silence. Just before I turned to hurry back up the aisle, The man on screen raised his left hand, with one finger extended, as if an idea had just occurred to him. He bent his wrist and pointed straight down. His lips moved noiselessly, and his eyes glimmered with something between mischief and sheer malice. I got the impression that he was speaking to some unseen character and asking them a question. His posture somehow implied that he was seconds away from lifting something into the frame and showing it to them. Something he was holding in his other hand. It was then that I realized that his face was not marred by old scars as I had originally thought. It was freshly scratched. The film itself was awfully scratchy, streaked with thin, cobwebby lines and blots of emulsion. It was almost like all the scratches and abrasions crisscrossing the reel were slicing him up right in front of me. I booked it out of Theater 3, and before I knew it, I was back behind the concession counter, back in the eerie normalcy of the brightly lit lobby. Clyde had left the stack of empty film canisters right where he always did, under the cash register. Each canister had a strip of peeling Scotch tape stuck to it, on which was scrawled a title in his barely legible handwriting. I hurriedly pulled them out one by one, held them up, and then set them on the counter. 2 reels of The Paleface, 5 reels of He Comes Up Smiling, 1 reel of Metzgernacht. Like I said before, I'm not much of a film buff, so I didn't recognize any of the titles. I just wanted something I could type into a search bar when I went home, which is exactly what I did. It's early Monday morning now. The sun will be up soon. My shift starts in a few hours. I know Clyde is going to rip me a new one for bailing on Friday without locking up properly. He'll want to know why I left in such a rush, and if I tell him, he'll want to know why I didn't call the police. I don't have a good answer for that one. The truth is, I've been in kind of a trance all weekend. Haven't slept much. I've been reading up on the film I saw in Theater 3. Buster Keaton made a movie called The Paleface. Douglas Fairbanks made a movie called He Comes Up Smiling. That one's considered a mostly lost film nowadays. Only fragments survive. But Clyde never let that stop him from turning a quick buck. He probably got his hands on a fragment, padded it out by stitching it to a bunch of unrelated clips, and called it a day. Either that, or he's got a one-of-a-kind item in his basement, and he's too blotto to realize it. The thing is, he could have all sorts of treasures and rarities stashed away down there, and he would be the last to know. That's the thought that's been keeping me up at night, because that third film, Metzgernacht, is also regarded as lost, and not just partially. Information on it is scarce. All we know is that it was a German horror film made in the late 1910s or early 1920s. Film historians can't even agree on who directed it or what it was about. The last surviving copy was supposedly destroyed in a fire during a screening at a mental hospital in Bucharest in 1951. Over the decades, in spite of its obscurity, it's garnered a reputation for being cursed. I wonder if the woman knew any of that when she came in out of the rain. I kept trying to force myself to remember what she murmured when I asked her what movie she had come to see. I don't know if Clyde brought the wrong film can out of the basement, or if I sent her into the wrong theater. I just know that I can't shake this guilty feeling. And there's something else I can't shake. Something else I'm trying to remember. I can't get that man's face out of my head. I haven't slept because I know I'll see it in my dreams. I don't want to see it ever again. But more than that, I don't want to see the thing he's holding in his right hand. The thing he keeps pointing at. I don't want to see what I think I saw on Friday night, just for a fraction of a second, at the very bottom of the frame, as the door to Theater 3 swung closed behind me. Clenched in his fist was a wet, dripping wad of shiny black hair. I don't think it was wet with rainwater.